Hey guys, tonight we slip through a palace door just as the sun drains out of the sky, when stone walls exhale the heat of the day and the polished floors begin to cool under your feet. You stand in that brief, purple moment where banners stop snapping and start sighing, where courtiers scatter like birds settling into roosts, and you realize the building is about to change personalities. By day, it performs power. By night, it survives. You probably won't survive this without drifting off at least once, because what you're about to hear is quieter, slower, and far more human than the throne room ever admits. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stay standing as the last echoes of daytime authority fade. Somewhere behind you, a heavy door closes, not slammed, just firmly enough to say, "That's it, the public is gone." This is the hour when rulers retreat into softer rooms, when crowns come off and slippers replace boots. And yet, strangely, the palace does not sleep. It exhales, stretches, and hands control to people you will never see carved into marble. You feel it first in the lighting. Torches flare to life in deliberate intervals, not randomly, not dramatically. There is a system here, and it's older than you expect. A mainstream historical fact quietly humming in the background. In medieval European palaces, specific servants known as sergeants or yeomen of the chamber were assigned nightly responsibility for lighting and locking, following written routines as strict as any modern security checklist. This isn't romance, it's logistics. You wouldn't want a draft in the wrong corridor, turning a palace into an accidental bonfire. Nobody wants to be remembered as the dynasty that went up because Dave forgot a candle. As you walk deeper, the sound changes. Daytime footsteps are loud, confident, echoing. Night footsteps are soft, almost apologetic. Servants move like they're borrowing the space rather than owning it. They carry keys heavy enough to bruise a hip, rings of iron teeth that could open 100 doors, some of which you suspect should never be opened at all. There's a tiny jingle when they walk, and everyone knows that sound. It's the palace's nocturnal heartbeat. You probably imagine night servants as background figures, faceless shadows. But here's a quirky tidbit historians love to slip into footnotes. In the forbidden city of Beijing, night duty eunuchs were sometimes rotated not for fairness, but because prolonged night work was believed to affect spiritual balance, making servants more susceptible to bad luck or malicious ghosts. Sleep deprivation, supernatural addition. Same stress, worse HR department. You pause by a corridor that smells faintly of wax and old wood. Someone passes you carrying a long taper, carefully relighting a wick that's drooped into darkness. The flame blooms, steady and controlled. Light is power here. Darkness is danger, rumor, and accident waiting to happen. Historians still argue whether the strict lighting protocols in royal residences were more about preventing fires or about controlling movement, because shadows make excellent accomplices. You feel watched, but not in a threatening way, more like monitored. The night servants know who belongs where, and you, despite being very polite and extremely quiet, feel like an anomaly. If this were real, someone would gently redirect you with a raised eyebrow and a cough that says, "Wrong corridor, friend." And this is the first secret of the palace at night. Authority changes hands without ceremony. There is no proclamation, no trumpet blast announcing, "Okay, everyone, the people with the actual skills are in charge now." But it happens all the same. The monarch may sleep behind 3 doors and a tapestry, but the people keeping the place standing, breathing, and unburnt are very much awake. You drift past a small chamber where ledgers are being updated by lamplight. Ink scratches softly, numbers balanced, inventories checked. This isn't glamorous, but it's essential. A palace consumes resources like a living creature: bread, candles, firewood, linen. Someone has to make sure tomorrow exists, and they're doing it now, when mistakes are less visible but more dangerous. A light joke slips in as you imagine explaining this to a time traveler. Yes, Your Majesty, the kingdom fell because we ran out of candles. It sounds silly until you remember that candle shortages were a real crisis in some courts. No light means no work, no guards, no safety. Civilization runs on wax and patience. As night deepens, you notice something else. Sound discipline. Doors are eased shut, not closed. Tools are wrapped in cloth. Even conversations are angled toward walls. Sleep is a political resource. Wake the wrong person, and your career ends faster than a torch in the rain. In some palaces, servants were fined for unnecessary noise after dark, a small but telling reminder that silence itself was regulated. You pass a window and glance out. The city beyond the palace walls is darker, messier, louder. Inside, everything is curated calm. This contrast is intentional. Rulers like to believe their residences were islands of order floating above the chaos of the world. At night, maintaining that illusion falls entirely to people whose names history barely remembers. There's a faint smell of food somewhere, nothing heavy, just broth, maybe warm bread. The night shift eats differently. Lighter meals, easier on the stomach when sleep is fragmented and stress is constant. You imagine someone joking quietly about how the king dreams of feasts while they survive on soup. Joke number 2 lands gently and keeps walking. You also feel the tension. Night magnifies risk. Fires start, thieves sneak, illness worsens, babies are born, people die. The palace at night is where consequences happen without an audience. It's why so many historical scandals, secret births, and quiet removals occurred after sunset. Darkness doesn't just hide things, it accelerates them. You slow your pace, matching the rhythm of the servants around you. This is not your palace, but for now, you're allowed to drift. Tomorrow, everything will reset. Daylight will return the illusion that power runs on speeches and ceremonies. But tonight, you can feel the truth humming in the walls. The secret servants are already at work, and you're just beginning to notice them. You keep moving, not because you're told to, but because stillness at night feels suspicious in a place like this. The corridors narrow slightly, the ceilings dip, just enough to remind you that these passages weren't designed for ceremony. They're arteries. And the people moving through them now carry objects far more powerful than swords, keys, candles, and the authority to use both without asking permission. You notice the keys first. They're enormous, unapologetically heavy, swinging from thick leather belts. Each one fits a specific lock, and each lock controls something vital: rooms, chests, gates, stairwells. In many European palaces, a single master key holder, known as the groom of the stool or Lord Chamberlain, held more literal power at night than most nobles did during the day. That's not metaphor. If you needed access after curfew, you needed them. Full stop. A mainstream historical fact slips in quietly. At Versailles, nighttime access to certain royal apartments was restricted so tightly that even high-ranking courtiers could be denied entry if they lacked the proper authorization token. Rank slept, keys did not. You walk alongside one of these key bearers now. He doesn't look dramatic, that's the point. Drama attracts attention, and attention attracts questions. His job is to prevent both. The ring at his hip is padded with cloth to stop it from clinking. Even power knows when to whisper. Candles come next, not the romantic kind you imagine flickering in paintings, but thick, practical pillars designed to burn evenly and predictably. Lamplighters move ahead of you in a slow, almost meditative rhythm. Light step, light, step. Each flame is placed with intention, creating a chain of visibility through the darkness. Too many candles waste resources and increase fire risk. Too few invite accidents, fear, and wandering thoughts. There is an art to this, and like most arts, it's practiced by people no one applauds. Here's a quirky tidbit to tuck into your mental pocket. In some Ottoman palaces, nighttime lighting patterns were adjusted to signal internal status changes. A corridor lit one way meant routine, lit another way meant illness, danger, or a high-ranking visitor moving unseen. It's mood lighting with consequences. You pause as a lamplighter trims a wick, fingers steady despite the heat. The smell of hot wax blooms and fades. This person knows exactly how long each candle will last, down to the minute. They know which drafts shorten burns, which hallways need extra light, because the stones sweat at night. Historians still argue whether such intimate environmental knowledge gave servants an informational advantage over their rulers, or whether it simply reinforced their invisibility. Locks click softly as doors are secured for the night. Not all of them. Some doors are intentionally left unlocked, though you'd never guess which by looking. This is where quiet power lives. The key bearers know the difference between symbolic security and functional security. A locked door is a promise. An unlocked one is a contingency. You pass a set of double doors sealed with a decorative bar. It looks solid, ceremonial. You suspect it hasn't been opened in years. Meanwhile, a narrow service passage nearby remains accessible because someone, somewhere, might need to move quickly with a tray, a message, or a body. Night planning is never optimistic. Light joke number 1 floats in as you imagine a modern office tour. And here's our emergency exit/scandal corridor. Please don't ask. The palace does not laugh, but you do, quietly. You begin to sense how access itself becomes a language. Who can go where, when, and under what light tells you everything about real hierarchies. At night, titles matter less than trust. A servant who's proven reliable at 3 a.m. holds more sway than a duke who sleeps through crises. You stop near a junction where 3 corridors meet. The lamplighter hesitates, adjusts a candle placement by inches. That tiny change shifts shadows, alters sightlines. Someone watching from a distance will now see silhouettes instead of faces. Someone approaching will be noticed sooner. This is chess played with fire. In imperial China, palace night watchmen carried wooden clappers instead of bells, tapping them in specific rhythms to mark time without alarming sleepers. The sound wasn't meant to wake anyone, it was meant to reassure. You're protected. Someone is awake. Go back to sleep. It's the ancient equivalent of a status light blinking on a router. Historians still argue whether these sound signals were primarily functional or psychological, but standing here, you can feel the answer leaning toward both. Human beings sleep better when they believe someone else is watching the dark. As you continue, you notice chalk marks near some doors, almost invisible unless you know to look. They're temporary notes, inspected, stocked, locked, gone by morning. Evidence erased. The palace wants to wake up, pretending it never needed supervision. Another joke drifts in, softer this time. If these servants had LinkedIn profiles, their endorsements would all read, "Excellent at preventing disasters you'll never hear about." You think about fire again, open flames everywhere, fabric, wood, oil. It's absurd, really. Yet palaces rarely burn down accidentally, considering the odds. That's not luck, that's routine. Night servants slept in shifts, fully dressed, ready to respond. Some even carried small fire-starting kits, not to cause fires, but to control them, burning back danger before it spread. You pass a narrow stairwell spiraling downward, locked now, opened later. Everything here breathes on a schedule. You're beginning to understand that the palace at night is less a place and more a process. Keys turn, candles glow, doors rest in states of deliberate uncertainty. And through it all, the servants move with practiced calm, holding the fragile illusion together until dawn can take the credit. You keep walking, deeper into the system, where light and access decide who matters and who disappears into shadow. You start to notice that the palace has ears. Not literal ones, obviously, although given some of the architectural flourishes you've seen, you wouldn't be shocked, but human ones, stationed carefully where sound travels best after dark, corridors that curve just enough to carry whispers, doorways that amplify murmurs when the daytime noise dies away. At night the building becomes an instrument, and certain servants know exactly how to play it. You slow near a junction where two guards stand too far apart to be chatting, yet close enough to share information without raising their voices. Their exchange is brief, coded, and immediately forgotten by anyone who overhears it by accident. These are the messengers, the listeners, the ones who ferry information when paper would be too slow or too risky. During the day, messages are written, sealed, announced. At night, they move mouth to ear, leaving no trace except altered decisions by morning. A mainstream historical fact slides into place here. Many royal courts maintained official night messengers, often young men chosen for stamina and discretion, who could move through restricted areas without written passes. In Tudor England, these roles overlapped with positions like the groom porter, who controlled after-hours access and reported unusual activity directly to the monarch. Night doesn't just hide secrets, it demands them. You pass a servant standing still in what looks like a decorative alcove. Too still. You realize he's listening, not to you, but to the corridor behind you. This is not paranoia, it's protocol. Night magnifies small sounds, fabric brushing stone, a breath taken too quickly. Someone trained to hear patterns can tell whether footsteps belong to a guard, a maid, or someone who absolutely shouldn't be here. Here's a quirky tidbit that feels almost modern. In some Renaissance palaces, servants were trained to recognize individuals by walking rhythm alone. Shoes, posture, weight distribution, it all tells a story. If the wrong story walked past at the wrong hour, alarms didn't ring. People did. You move past a partially open door where two figures sit close together, heads bent. No candles inside, just spillover light from the hall. This is intentional. Shadows protect faces, voices drop. You don't hear words, but you feel urgency. Political alliances, personal favors, warnings, all of them migrate to night because daylight witnesses too much. Historians still argue whether these informal nighttime information networks were more influential than official councils, but you suspect the truth leans toward yes, and heavily. Decisions are rarely born in rooms full of people. They're incubated in corners like this. A light joke drifts through your mind as you imagine a servant whispering, "This meeting could have been an email," then remembering that emails won't exist for several more centuries. Even so, the instinct is timeless. Secrecy loves efficiency. You turn another corner and nearly bump into a runner, barely more than a shadow, who murmurs an apology and vanishes down a side passage. His job is speed, not explanation. Somewhere, someone will wake slightly, receive a sentence, and fall back asleep, changed. By morning, a policy shifts. A marriage is reconsidered. A rival is suddenly unwelcome. In Imperial Japan, night watchmen known as tsukiban rotated through listening posts, reporting disturbances not just of sound but of mood. A palace felt wrong before it looked wrong. That belief that tension could be sensed guided patrols as much as maps did. It sounds mystical, until you remember how much information lives in tone, pacing, and silence. You linger near a tapestry depicting some heroic daytime moment. A king on horseback, banners high, everyone very visible. Behind it, you know there's likely a narrow passage, perfect for moving unseen. The irony isn't lost on you. Public history hangs in front, private history slips behind. Another joke arrives, softer. Imagine being immortalized in art while the real power walks past you behind the wall, carrying a tray and 3 secrets. Sleep-friendly humor, but it lands. You start to feel the emotional weight of this work. Listening is not neutral. Absorbing other people's fear, ambition, and desperation at night changes you. Some servants became addicted to information, others numb to it. A few, historians suggest, manipulated what they heard, selectively forgetting messages to shape outcomes. Historians still argue whether this was corruption or an unofficial balancing mechanism in rigid hierarchies. You hear a soft cough, a signal and not illness, a listener acknowledging another, all clear, continue. The palace communicates in micro-gestures now. As you move on, you realize that nothing said at night is ever truly forgotten, even if no record exists. Words lodge in people, alter loyalties, resurface years later as justification or regret. The night servants are not passive conduits, they are filters. You take a breath, careful to keep it quiet. Somewhere nearby, another whisper begins, another message changes hands. By the time dawn arrives, no one will credit these exchanges. They'll praise the ruler's wisdom, the court's stability, but you know better now. The palace listens at night, and the servants decide what it hears. You follow the faint smell of warm grain and simmering herbs, because even at night, power gets hungry. The palace kitchens don't blaze like they do at midday. No shouting, no clatter of dozens of hands, but they never fully shut down. They hum, a low, careful hum designed to keep rulers fed, safe, and very much alive until morning. You step into a side kitchen first, smaller and cleaner than the grand hall you've probably seen in paintings. This one is practical. A pot bubbles gently, attended by a cook whose movements are so economical they almost look tired. Night cooking is about control, not spectacle. The meals are lighter, easier to digest, less likely to provoke indigestion, nightmares, or suspicion. You didn't think food could be political at 2 a.m., but here you are. A mainstream historical fact settles in. Many royal courts employed official night cooks or bouche de nuit staff, especially in France, responsible for preparing late meals, broths, and medicinal foods for monarchs who kept irregular hours. Louis XIV himself was notorious for eating at odd times, and the kitchen adapted around him, not the other way around. You watch a servant ladle broth into a small covered bowl. Another tastes it first, always. The taster's face is calm, unreadable. Poison wasn't constant, but the fear of it was. This ritual persists even when threat levels are low, because tradition is cheaper than regret. Historians still argue whether poison testing at night was more about real danger or about reassuring anxious rulers who slept better knowing someone else took the first sip. Here's a quirky tidbit that feels oddly intimate. In some palaces, tasters were instructed to wait several minutes after tasting before allowing food to pass on, even if it cooled slightly. Better a lukewarm meal than a dead king. Culinary disappointment beats dynastic collapse every time. You notice how quiet everyone is. Utensils are wrapped, lids are eased on and off. Even firewood is chosen for how softly it burns. The kitchen becomes almost monastic, a place of focus and restraint. Light joke number 1 slides in as you imagine a modern cooking show hosted at whisper volume. Tonight, we're reducing this sauce and our overall volume. A side table holds herbs laid out carefully, mint, fennel, chamomile, not for flavor but for sleep, digestion, nerves. Night food blurs into medicine. In some traditions, astrologers advised kitchens on what ingredients suited the ruler's current planetary alignment. Yes, really. Dinner by horoscope. Historians still argue whether astrology genuinely influenced menus or simply provided a convenient explanation when meals went wrong. You move deeper and catch sight of bread rising slowly near a warm surface. Tomorrow's loaves begin now. The palace plans its future in yeast and patience. You think about how many people will wake expecting breakfast, never considering the quiet labor that made it possible. A servant slips in carrying a small tray, destined for private chambers. It's covered, sealed, marked. Access control extends to food. Who eats what, when, and from whose hands matters deeply. In some courts, specific servants were trusted to deliver night meals because familiarity reduced paranoia. If the same face brought your soup every night, you slept better. Power craves routine. Another joke drifts through, gentler this time. Imagine trusting your life nightly to the same person who can't legally look you in the eye during the day. Strange Intimacy Palace Edition. You notice a ledger being updated nearby, ingredients used, portions sent, tasters assigned. Documentation never sleeps. If something goes wrong, the paper trail begins here, under flickering light. In the Ottoman court, certain night foods were prepared exclusively for the harem or inner circle, and their recipes were guarded like state secrets. Flavor was identity. A familiar dish could calm a restless ruler more effectively than any guard at the door. You lean against a cool stone wall and listen to the soft rhythm of work. This isn't frantic, it's deliberate. The night kitchen exists to prevent extremes. No hunger, no excess, no surprises. As you turn to leave, the smell of bread follows you, comforting and grounding. It reminds you that even in the most powerful places on earth, survival depends on warm food prepared by people who will never sit at the table. The palace sleeps easier because the kitchens don't. You leave the warmth of the kitchens behind and step back into cooler air, where stone and silence reclaim their authority. This is the realm of doors, thresholds, and the people who decide what crosses them after dark. Guards don't just stand watch now, they interpret the night. You stop near a massive wooden door reinforced with iron bands. During the day it's ceremonial, swung open to impress. At night it's something else entirely, a line. 2 guards flank it, faces relaxed but eyes alert, bodies angled to see both corridor and shadow. Their posture tells you everything. Nothing dramatic is expected, but everything is possible. A mainstream historical fact grounds you here. Many palaces employed layered night guard systems with inner and outer watches that answered to different chains of command. In the Byzantine court, eunuch guards often controlled inner chambers precisely because they were seen as less likely to threaten dynastic legitimacy. Trust in this context was engineered. You watch as a servant approaches the door with a small token, wood, stamped with a symbol. One guard inspects it, the other watches the corridor. No conversation. A nod. The door opens just wide enough to let the servant through, then closes again. Access granted, access erased. Here's a quirky tidbit that feels almost cinematic. In some Mughal palaces, night guards memorized not just faces but expected reasons for movement. If your excuse didn't match the hour, you were turned away no matter who sent you. Time itself became a password. You follow along the wall, noticing subtle marks near hinges, tiny scratches only guards would recognize. They indicate wear, tampering, or normal use. The night watch reads doors the way sailors read stars. Historians still argue whether these observational skills were formally taught or passed down informally through mentorship and long, boring nights. A light joke slips in as you imagine a guard's training manual. Lesson 1, this door squeaks differently when it's lying to you. You approach a narrower passage where a single guard stands seemingly alone, but you sense others nearby, just out of sight. Night security relies on overlap. No one is ever truly alone, even when it looks that way. If something happens, response is immediate, silent, and decisive. In Imperial China, palace guards used call and response phrases at night, changing them frequently to prevent imposters. Get the phrase wrong and you didn't get corrected, you got detained. Or worse, the system wasn't gentle, but it was effective. You notice how guards shift weight, stretch fingers, rotate positions. Night duty is physically demanding in a different way. Stillness becomes strain. Fatigue is the enemy. Some guards chewed mild stimulants or relied on rhythmic movement to stay alert. Historians still argue whether such practices improved vigilance or merely delayed exhaustion. Another joke drifts in, softer. The original standing desk, except you can't sit, scroll, or complain. You pass a locked stairwell leading upward. The guard there glances at you, not suspicious, just aware. You feel seen without being challenged. That's intentional. Night security works best when it's visible enough to deter, but subtle enough not to alarm sleepers. You realize that these guardians aren't just protecting people, they're protecting narratives. Nothing disruptive should reach the ruler's dreams. No raised voices, no sudden news, no visible fear. The palace must appear calm, even when it isn't. A muffled sound echoes somewhere distant. The guards don't react outwardly, but you feel the shift. One adjusts his stance, another's hand moves closer to his belt. Information travels faster than noise here. Then it passes. Normal again, or at least normal enough. You keep moving, understanding now that every locked door is a decision, every guard a filter. Night justice is quiet, preemptive, and rarely recorded. The palace rests on the judgment of people who will never be thanked for preventing things that never happened. And as you drift onward, you sense that some doors, once closed at night, will never open again. You notice the smell before you see the work, water, ash, and something faintly metallic that the palace pretends not to recognize. This is the hour when messes disappear, when yesterday's drama is scrubbed into anonymity before the sun can ask questions. Cleaning at night isn't housekeeping, it's historical editing. You follow the sound of slow, deliberate scrubbing down a side corridor rarely used by daylight guests. The workers here don't chatter, they don't rush. Every motion is measured because haste leaves traces. A woman kneels with a bucket at her side, cloth wrapped tightly around her hand, rubbing at stone that's darker than the rest. You don't ask why. The palace doesn't answer questions at this hour. A mainstream historical fact grounds you again. In many royal courts, cleaning staff worked primarily at night to ensure public spaces appeared untouched by human strain come morning. At the Vatican and Versailles alike, night cleaners were tasked with removing candle wax, food remnants, mud, and, when necessary, blood, long before anyone important woke up. Dawn demanded perfection. You watch as wax drips are carefully chipped away, not scraped, scraping scars, stone, chipping erases without trace. This is learned knowledge passed hand to hand. The palace floor is a ledger of what's been allowed to remain visible. Here's a quirky tidbit that feels unsettling in its practicality. Some palaces kept separate cleaning tools for ordinary messes and sensitive incidents. The materials weren't labelled, but everyone knew. Use the wrong cloth in the wrong place, and you didn't get a second mistake. Historians still argue whether this separation was about hygiene or about psychological distancing for the workers themselves. You drift past a small storage room where buckets are emptied, cloths rinsed repeatedly until the water runs clear. Clear enough? Nothing is ever truly gone, but it can be diluted into acceptability. The cleaners know which stains will lighten and which will always ghost back through stone if the light hits them right. They adjust candle placement accordingly. Even illumination becomes part of the erasure. A light joke wanders through your tired mind. The original content moderation team removing anything that violates the palace's terms of service. You smile quietly and keep walking. You hear murmured instructions, short, neutral, no names, no details. Language becomes abstract at night. There. Again. Enough. Emotional distance is survival. The people doing this work can't afford to imagine causes, only outcomes. In some medieval courts, night cleaners were sworn to silence under threat of punishment, not because their employers feared gossip, but because the act of speaking could solidify memory. If no one talked about it, maybe it hadn't really happened. Historians still argue whether enforced silence reduced scandal or merely concentrated trauma among the servants. You pass a staircase where water is being poured slowly down each step, carrying dirt into channels built for exactly this purpose. The architecture knows the palace was designed with cleanup in mind. Grooves, drains, hidden slopes. Power anticipates mess. You notice chalk marks again, similar to the ones you saw earlier, this time near cleaned areas. Temporary confirmations, addressed, inspected, resolved. By morning, these will be wiped away too. Evidence of erasure must itself be erased. Another joke slips in, gentler and darker. Imagine explaining your job title as Night Eraser of Inconvenient Reality. Not exactly something you put on a calling card. You pause near a tapestry being carefully lifted from the wall. Behind it, the stone is discoloured. Two cleaners work together here, coordinated, silent. They don't rush. Tapestries lie. Walls remember. The goal isn't to restore truth, just uniformity. In imperial Rome, slaves known as Atrienses were responsible for maintaining household spaces overnight, including removing signs of punishment or illness before guests arrived. The wealthy wanted their homes to appear untouched by suffering. The tradition never really died, it just got better uniforms. You start to feel the emotional gravity of this work pressing down. These servants see consequences before explanations, endings without beginnings. They know which nights matter because the stains are different, heavier, more resistant, more final. They learn not to ask whose fault it was. Fault is a daylight concept. Historians still argue whether night cleaning roles attracted a certain personality type or shaped one over time. Standing here, you suspect it's both. The palace doesn't just select people, it molds them. You notice one cleaner pause, stretch fingers, breathe. Fatigue shows in small ways. Knees ache, hands crack from water and ash. Yet the work continues because the palace must wake spotless, serene, innocent. You step back as a bucket is carried past you. Water dark, but manageable. The servant doesn't look at you. That's intentional. Witnesses complicate things. As you move on, the corridor behind you already looks untouched, anonymous, ready for footsteps that will never know what happened there hours ago. History, cleaned and folded away. You understand now that power doesn't just decide events, it decides what survives them. And the night servants make sure the morning believes the right version. The air changes again as you move on, picking up a sharper edge. Herbs crushed too recently, vinegar, smoke from something burned on purpose. This is where the palace treats itself when the world is asleep. Medicine by moonlight doesn't look like healing in paintings. It looks like vigilance, compromise, and a quiet fear of getting it wrong. You pause outside a modest chamber, lit more brightly than the corridors around it. Light here is not wasteful, it's necessary. Inside, a healer bends over a low table, scattered with jars, powders, folded cloths. No dramatic robes, no chanting, just sleeves rolled up and a mind working through possibilities. The night doesn't allow for theatrics. A mainstream historical fact settles into place. In many royal courts, physicians and surgeons were required to be available overnight, sometimes sleeping in rooms adjacent to the ruler's chambers. Sudden illness didn't respect schedules, and neither could those tasked with preserving dynasties. In early modern Europe, a monarch's nighttime fever could trigger political panic before sunrise. You watch as a servant delivers a small cup, covered, marked. The healer tastes a drop, waits, always waiting. Poison and medicine shared shelves far more often than anyone liked to admit. The line between remedy and harm was thin and sometimes crossed by accident. Historians still argue whether medieval and early modern treatments helped more than they hurt, but what's certain is that doing nothing was rarely considered an option. Here's a quirky tidbit that feels both absurd and logical. Some palace healers timed treatments according to astrological charts, believing certain hours made medicines more effective or less dangerous. A purge at dawn, a poultice at midnight. The stars apparently also worked night shifts. You step aside as an astrologer enters, robes whispering softly. He consults a chart, murmurs something about Mars rising. The healer nods, not necessarily in belief, but in acknowledgement. In a palace, reassurance is part of the cure. If the ruler believed the treatment aligned with the heavens, they slept better. And sleep, inconveniently, actually helps. A light joke drifts through your thoughts. Imagine telling someone, "Good news, your treatment is going great. The planets agree." You keep it to yourself. In another corner, you glimpse a poison tester, seated quietly, waiting. Not testing on anything yet, just being present. Their role is preventative, symbolic, and deeply human. Someone else will take the risk first, even if the risk is mostly imagined. Historians still argue whether poison testers truly reduced danger or mainly reduced anxiety, but in a place like this, anxiety itself can be fatal. You notice how calm everyone is, not relaxed, calm. Voices low, movements precise. Panic wastes energy and clouds judgment. Night medicine is about containment. Whatever is happening must not ripple outward. A coughing fit is muffled. A groan is met with a hand and a look that says, "Not now." In the Ottoman court, chief physicians sometimes prepared night remedies personally rather than delegating, believing darkness increased the chance of error. Fatigue was accepted as the price of control. You think about that, how trust tightens as visibility fades. You drift past a small table where instruments are laid out, cleaned, aligned. Knives, needles, cups. They gleam softly, not threatening, just ready. The palace never wants to be surprised. Even at 3 a.m., preparation continues. Another joke arrives, softer than the rest. The original overnight on-call shift, except your patient is the state. You sense the emotional weight again. These healers see rulers without armor, sweating, shaking, afraid. They hear confessions muttered in half-sleep, regrets, spoken to no one else. Power dissolves quickly under illness. Night medicine is where humanity leaks through the cracks. Historians still argue whether this proximity gave physicians undue influence over political decisions. When you're the person easing pain at the worst hour, your advice carries extra weight. You don't need to scheme. Trust does the work for you. You step back into the corridor as the door closes gently behind you. Inside, someone drinks, waits, breathes. Outside, the palace continues its careful orbit around survival. You move on, understanding now that at night, medicine isn't just about curing bodies, it's about stabilizing power, one heartbeat at a time. And the servants who do it will vanish again by morning, leaving only the illusion of uninterrupted strength. The palace grows quieter still as you move deeper into the hours that technically belong to tomorrow. This is the stretch of night where even practical concerns soften, where fear gives way to ritual, and where protection takes on meanings that don't fit neatly into ledgers or guard rotations. You feel it in the air, a shift from vigilance to reassurance. Sacred work prefers the dark. You pause near a small chamber you hadn't noticed before, tucked between corridors like an afterthought. Inside, a single flame burns steadily, not bright, not dim, intentional. A robed figure murmurs words you don't quite catch, not because they're secret, but because they're not meant for you. These are the palace's spiritual night workers, priests, monks, ritual specialists, tasked with guarding what locks and weapons cannot. A mainstream historical fact settles in. Many royal residences maintain chapels or shrines staffed around the clock, with night prayers specifically dedicated to the ruler's safety. In medieval Europe, monks performed nocturnal offices, matins and lauds, while courts slept, believing continuous prayer maintained divine favor, protection outsourced to heaven. You watch as incense is lit, the smoke curling upward and clinging to stone. The scent isn't overpowering, it's grounding, something to anchor the mind when darkness invites imagination. In some palaces, specific resins were burned only at night, believed to deter malevolent spirits that grew bold after sunset. Here's a quirky tidbit that feels both mystical and practical. In ancient Egyptian royal compounds, priests conducted nightly rituals to symbolically reseal the world against chaos, reenacting the triumph of order over darkness every single evening. Imagine resetting the universe before bed, no pressure. You notice how careful the movements are. No sudden gestures, no raised voices. Ritual at night isn't about spectacle, it's about continuity. Do it the same way every time and the world behaves. Historians still argue whether these rites were expressions of genuine belief or tools to manage collective anxiety within power centers. Standing here, you suspect they were both, layered together like smoke and stone. A light joke floats in gently, the original cybersecurity update, but for demons. You move along and glimpse a guard standing respectfully outside the chamber, head slightly bowed. Even security acknowledges limits. There are threats steel can't stop, at least not in the imagination of the age. Better to cover all bases, physical, spiritual, cosmic. In imperial China, Taoist priests performed night rituals within palace grounds to harmonize energy flows, ensuring the emperor's dreams were undisturbed. Dreams mattered. An ill-omened dream could reshape policy by morning. You start to realize how much of governance rested on sleep quality. You pass a niche where protective symbols are etched discreetly into stone. You wouldn't notice them unless you knew to look. That's intentional. Protection works best when it doesn't announce itself. The servants who maintain these spaces do so quietly, correcting a candle angle here, brushing dust there. Faith requires maintenance too. Another joke drifts through, softer still. Imagine being on call to protect the empire from ghosts between midnight and dawn. Career paths were wild back then. You feel the emotional tone change. The tension you've carried loosens slightly, that's the point. These rituals don't just protect rulers, they calm the entire ecosystem of the palace. When servants believe the night is being watched by higher powers, they move with more confidence. Fear recedes. Historians still argue whether belief in nocturnal rituals improved morale measurably, but morale is hard to quantify when everyone sleeps better afterward. You step back into the corridor as a chant fades into silence. The flame continues to burn, steady and patient. It will be extinguished just before dawn, leaving no sign it ever mattered. But it did. For hours, it held the dark at bay. You move on, aware now that power doesn't just defend itself with walls and guards. It hedges its bets calling on every possible ally, visible or not, to survive the night. And somewhere behind you a prayer finishes and the palace exhales again. You move now into spaces that daylight pretends belong to no one in particular, but at night quietly answer to women. The air softens here. Not weaker, just different. The palace's inner rooms breathe with a steadier rhythm, one shaped by caretaking, memory, and long familiarity rather than command. You pass through a narrow doorway into the private zones, sleeping chambers, nurseries, dressing rooms where the power of proximity outweighs the power of title. The women who work here don't carry keys on their belts or weapons at their sides. They carry knowledge, who wakes easily, who sleeps lightly, who cries out when dreaming, and who pretends they never do. A mainstream historical fact anchors this shift across many royal courts, from medieval Europe to imperial China. Female servants, such as ladies-in-waiting, wet nurses and chambermaids, were entrusted with nighttime access to the most intimate spaces of rulers' lives. This wasn't incidental. Trust here was cultivated over years, sometimes generations. You pause near a cradle, half hidden behind a screen. A nurse rocks gently, barely moving, humming under her breath. Babies don't care about dynasties, but dynasties care very much about babies. Night is when fevers spike, cries start, and futures wobble. The women here are the first responders to history's smallest, loudest emergencies. Here's a quirky tidbit that feels oddly modern. In some courts, senior ladies-in-waiting kept informal sleep logs, mental notes of a ruler's restlessness, mood upon waking, and night habits. These observations shaped advice, timing, and even political strategy. Historians still argue whether such influence was deliberate manipulation or simply the byproduct of constant closeness. You drift past a chamber where a maid adjusts blankets, careful not to wake the sleeper. The gesture is practiced, almost tender. Power, stripped of audience, looks fragile. Breathing matters more than rank here. A light joke drifts through your mind. Imagine holding the fate of the realm because you know which pillow someone hates. Absurd until it isn't. In the Ottoman harem, night belonged almost entirely to women. Eunuchs guarded thresholds, but inside, women managed schedules, comfort, conflict, and silence. They knew which doors to close harder, which whispers to soothe, which tensions to ignore until morning. The inner night ran on emotional intelligence. You notice how communication works here. Touches, glances, tiny nods. Loud authority would shatter the calm. Everything is negotiated softly. Historians still argue whether these women wielded hidden power or were merely buffers protecting rulers from reality. Standing here, you see how blurry that line really is. You pause as two maids exchange a look over a sleeping figure's shallow breath. One leaves quietly, returning moments later with a warmed cloth. No summons, no command. Anticipation replaces orders at night. Another joke floats by, gentle and tired. The original night shift, except your performance review depends on whether someone wakes up grumpy. You sense how much of the palace's emotional labor concentrates here. Daylight rewards speeches and decisions. Night rewards steadiness. These women absorb fear, frustration, loneliness. They hear confessions whispered into pillows and never repeated. Silence becomes currency. In some European courts, ladies-in-waiting slept in the same rooms as queens, not for luxury, but for safety and immediacy. Fire, illness, childbirth. Night did not wait for permission. You feel the weight of that responsibility settle in your chest. You move on quietly, aware that these inner rooms shape rulers long before councils ever do. Tomorrow's decisions will be made by people whose sleep was protected, comforted, or disrupted here. As you leave, the hum returns, soft footsteps, fabric brushing stone, a cradle's gentle creak. The palace's most private power keeps watch, unseen, ensuring the night passes without breaking anyone important. The night sharpens again as you drift away from the inner chambers, as if the palace itself knows you're approaching a more dangerous edge of its routine. This is where softness ends and consequences begin. Justice doesn't sleep, but it does lower its voice. You feel it in the way corridors straighten, in how light becomes more functional than comforting. No incense here, no lullabies, just stone, iron, and people who understand that some matters are best handled when fewer eyes are open. The palace doesn't like to advertise its corrections. A door opens ahead of you, not dramatically, just enough to admit a figure who looks smaller in the half-light than they probably did at noon. 2 guards flank them, not gripping, not dragging, simply present. This is restraint without spectacle. Night justice avoids scenes. Scenes leave memories. A mainstream historical fact anchors this uneasy space. Many royal courts conducted interrogations, hearings, or preliminary judgments at night to preserve public order and avoid unrest. In early modern Europe, palace officials often questioned suspects after curfew when secrecy reduced rumour and resistance. Justice, here, was as much about timing as truth. You stand back as the group passes, no names are spoken, names complicate things. The accused, or accused adjacent, keeps their eyes down, not in submission, but in calculation. Night amplifies thought, every step echoes louder inside the head. Here's a quirky tidbit that feels chillingly efficient. In some courts, scribes were not present during nighttime interrogations. Notes were reconstructed later from memory by officials, allowing flexibility in wording and interpretation. Historians still argue whether this practice was meant to protect the innocent from permanent record or to protect power from inconvenient accuracy. You follow at a distance, just close enough to feel the temperature drop. The room they enter is plain, intentionally forgettable. No banners. No symbols. Authority doesn't need decoration here. A single table, a chair, a lamp positioned to cast light downward, not outward. The shadows are heavy. A light joke tries to surface, something about bad lighting choices, but it doesn't quite land. The room absorbs humour without returning it. The questioning begins quietly. No raised voices, no threats, at least not spoken. Night interrogations rely on fatigue, isolation, and the weight of silence. The questions are simple, repeated, patient. Answers drift, contradict, collapse. Time stretches. Historians still argue whether night questioning was more effective because it caught people off guard, or more unreliable because exhaustion distorts memory. Standing here, you suspect both are true, which is exactly why it persisted. You notice how the guards don't intervene. They don't need to. Their presence is enough. The accused knows that whatever happens next won't be witnessed by a crowd or debated publicly. That knowledge presses harder than any shout. Somewhere nearby, a bell rings softly. Not an alarm, but a marker of time passing. In certain palaces, these signals regulated not just watches, but procedures. After a certain hour, decisions shifted from corrective to final. The night has phases, and this is not the forgiving one. Another joke drifts in weekly. The worst customer service hours imaginable. No manager, no appeal, no daylight. It fades quickly, as it should. You step back as the door closes. You don't see the outcome. That's intentional. Night justice doesn't invite spectators. By morning, consequences will already be in motion. Dismissals, reassignments, quiet confinements, or disappearances explained away as transfers or illnesses. In imperial Rome, accusations against palace staff were sometimes resolved overnight, with punishments carried out before dawn to prevent unrest. The city woke believing stability had simply continued. Historians still argue whether such practices maintained order or merely delayed reckoning. You move on, unsettled but understanding. The palace prefers clean lines. Problems introduced by humans must be removed with similar efficiency. There is no drama here, only maintenance. As you pass another corridor, you glimpse a servant kneeling, head bowed, waiting. Not accused, not condemned, just suspended in uncertainty. Waiting is one of Night Justice's favorite tools. It costs nothing and erodes everything. You feel the emotional weight settle again, heavier than before. This is where loyalty is tested, corrected, or extinguished. Daylight courts pretend justice is blind. Night justice admits it sees perfectly well and chooses anyway. You keep walking because stopping feels inappropriate. The palace doesn't linger on its own shadows. It moves past them, smooths the surface, and prepares explanations for the sun. Behind you, a decision finalizes. Ahead of you, the night continues its work, indifferent to fairness, but devoted to continuity. Power corrects itself quietly, and the palace ensures you'll never hear the full story in the morning. The night doesn't ease after justice, it tightens. This is the hour when the palace listens for sounds that shouldn't exist at all, the crackle that isn't a hearth, the drip that isn't a fountain, the wind that smells wrong. Disaster prefers darkness, and the servants who guard against it learn to trust unease more than sight. You feel the tension in the way people move faster now, routes shortened, eyes scanning ceilings as often as floors. Fires, floods, collapses, these are the enemies no one can negotiate with. They don't care about rank, ritual, or lineage. The night crews exist because stone and wood eventually fail. A mainstream historical fact anchors this vigilance. Most large palaces maintain dedicated night fire watches, often sleeping in shifts near water sources. At Versailles, guards patrolled specifically to detect smoke and overheating chimneys because a single unchecked ember could end a dynasty faster than rebellion. The palace knew exactly how flammable it was. You pause near an open window where a servant tests the air with practiced subtlety. Not dramatic sniffing, just awareness. Wind direction matters. Smoke travels. Disaster announces itself early if you're listening. Historians still argue whether palace fires were truly rare or simply underreported, but what's clear is how much effort went into preventing them. Here's a quirky tidbit that feels strangely modern. Some palaces kept emergency demolition tools, axes, hooks, ready to tear down parts of the building to stop a fire's spread. Imagine loving a room enough to destroy it on purpose. Prevention sometimes looks like violence. A light joke slips in gently. The original disaster response team, minus the press conference, and with significantly worse sleep schedules. You follow a small group toward the lower levels, where water channels run beneath the palace. Someone has noticed a change, a sound too fast, a dampness too new. Flooding is quieter than fire, more patient. The servants crouch, inspect, gesture. A blockage is cleared. The threat recedes. No one celebrates. That would be tempting fate. In Imperial China, night crews monitored not just structures, but omens tied to natural events. Earth tremors, unusual animal behavior, changes in water flow. A rat fleeing a wall at midnight could trigger inspections by dawn. Historians still argue whether this was superstition or empirical pattern recognition dressed in symbolism. You sense the exhaustion now. These workers live in a constant state of readiness, adrenaline cycling without release. Some chew on bits of cloth or carry charms, not because they're foolish, but because ritual steadies hands when logic runs out. Another joke drifts through, softer than before. When your job description is prevent the apocalypse quietly, you don't get a lot of performance feedback. You move past a stack of sandbags hidden behind a screen, ugly but essential. Disasters don't care about aesthetics. The palace hides its ugly preparations the same way it hides its ugly outcomes. A sudden shout echoes, quick, sharp, then stops. You freeze. So does everyone else. A moment passes, a false alarm, a dropped tool. Laughter doesn't follow. The night accepts no relief until morning. Historians still argue whether constant disaster preparedness made palaces safer or simply more anxious environments to inhabit. Standing here, you realize safety and anxiety are often roommates. As you move on, the palace settles again, its systems holding. Nothing collapses, nothing burns, nothing floods. That's success. Invisible, exhausting success. You understand now that survival isn't heroic, it's repetitive. It's people noticing small wrongnesses and correcting them before they earn names. The night crews will never be painted rescuing the palace from catastrophe because catastrophe never quite arrived. And that, paradoxically, is their greatest achievement. You feel the night begin to loosen its grip, not all at once, but in subtle ways the palace knows by heart. The air cools differently, the silence thins. Somewhere far off, a bird tests the idea of morning and thinks better of it. This is the hour when the secret servants start to disappear. You walk familiar corridors now, but they're changing. Candles burn lower, intentionally allowed to die rather than replaced. Keys return to hooks. Guards shift from watchfulness to readiness for handover. The palace doesn't announce the transition. It simply slides into it like a practiced breath. A mainstream historical fact settles gently here. In many royal courts, night staff were required to vacate visible areas before dawn, ensuring rulers appeared to wake into a palace that had never truly been awake without them. Continuity mattered, illusion mattered more. You notice how quickly evidence fades. Chalk marks wiped, tools stowed, buckets emptied. The people who held the palace together for hours now fold themselves into shadows, corridors, servant stairwells. By the time daylight staff arrive, it will look as though nothing happened. And that is the point. Here's a quirky tidbit that feels almost poetic. Some palaces rang a soft internal bell just before sunrise, not to wake anyone, but to signal night workers that their authority was ending. Power returned on schedule. Historians still argue whether this strict separation between night and day roles reinforced hierarchy or protected everyone involved from knowing too much. You suspect it did both. A light joke drifts in, barely there. The ultimate ghost shift, you do everything, then vanish. You pass a window and see the sky paling, that thin grey blue that feels like forgiveness. The palace straightens its spine. Soon voices will rise, doors will open wide, and history will pretend it runs on speeches again. But you know what happened here. You felt the keys, the whispers, the scrubbing, the watching. You know that power survives the night only because ordinary people refuse to sleep when it's most vulnerable. You slow your steps. There's no need to rush now. The danger has passed. The system's held. The palace will wake, believing in its own strength. And you, gently, can let go too. The corridors soften. The sounds blur. The night servants are already gone, and the story begins to fade at the edges like a dream you don't quite want to keep sharp. You breathe out. You're safe. Everything important made it through the dark. Sleep can take over now.